Good morning. It's nice to see
Hello.
everyone this morning. My name is David Smith. I'm the president of the Forage Center for Peace Building and Humanitarian Education. I am so glad to see everyone this morning for this Forage Center conversation on educators can counter racism. It's going to be moderated by Lena Chowdhury, and our guest today is Dr. Sarah Dorr. So, a couple things to start off and let you know. One is that this is being recorded. And after the event, the program will end up on our YouTube page. And I will give you the link to that at the end of the program on how you could find that later. It takes a few days to do that. So it's going to be there. Um, with regard to questions that you have during the program, there are two ways in which you can do that. One is if you want to put a question in the chat, I'm going to be monitoring the chat. And if I feel the question is kind of timely to what Sarah is talking about at the moment, then I'll give her the question. Or maybe she'll follow the chat also and she can answer it. Or you can just kind of wait till the very end when we do question and answer, and then you can raise your hand and we can do questions there. This will go for an hour. A little bit before the end of the hour, we will bring the conversation to a halt. I'll tell you a little bit the Forage Center, and we'll send you on your way. So again, thank you so much for being here. If you've got questions as we're going through that are more of a technical nature, let me know. It's great that you have your cameras on. I always prefer that. It's always good to see people when we're doing this, but I would ask everyone to put their Audible on mute during the program unless they're actually asking a question. That makes sense also going through. Okay. So we are our program today is our guest is Dr. Sarah Dorr, and Lena will introduce her, but I want to introduce Lena. Lena Chowdhury is our moderator today. She's a professor of nursing at Montgomery College, which is in suburban Washington, D.C. She has been a program specialist with the Forage Center for over 10 years or 10 years. We've actually, the Forage Center has been operating for 10 years. And she's also an expert in experiential education. She's a registered nurse. She's also an attorney, so she'll be our host today. Before I turn it over to her, let me just say a little bit about the Forage Center before we kind of get going. The Forage Center is a 501c3 corporation based outside of Washington, D.C. We were formed in 2015, and we focus on humanitarian and peace building education. So we run a summer program for graduate students on humanitarian practices. We also run practice programs during the year for undergraduates and other populations who are interested in experiential based training in programs that have to do with humanitarian work. On our peace building end, which I think this falls more into, we focus on peace, social justice, other types of issues that are related to that. We run an annual fall national seminar for community college faculty, which we hosted for the 12th time last year. And we will do that again this year. So I will stop there without any further ado, and I will continue to let people in. I'm going to turn it over to Lena, and I'm going to put myself on mute, and we'll look forward to the conversation. So, Lena, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Dave. I am so honored to introduce Dr. Sarah Dorr as an educator, and I'm always confronted with and always very cognizant of racism in the classroom, in the work environment. And I always feel like I need as much support and as many resources and as many philosophies that I can get my hands on. So when Dr. Dorr said she'd be willing to talk to us, I was thrilled. Let me give you a little bit of background about her. Has come from 20 years of a variety of settings, including higher education, nonprofits, international exchanges, and public libraries. And I love librarians, my favorite people in the world. Um, During that time, though, she's always had a focus on educational equity and increasing access to opportunities. And in the last 5 years in particular, she's focused on anti-racism education, including the development and facilitation of community-based virtual reading and discussion groups, and research about the efficacy of such groups for countering racism. And that is just a really tiny little snapshot. So, Dr. Dorr, if you wouldn't mind continuing that introduction, tell us more about yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Lena. Can everyone hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up if you can. All right, excellent. Thank you. So as Lena said, my name is Dr. Sarah Dorr, and I'm here because I'm not an expert on this subject, but I am someone who's passionate about this subject, who tries to bring in my positionality, my specific role in the world as a white professional woman, and the roles that I play that are either upholding or countering racism. So I'm hoping that we can all be co-learners together in this conversation. There's are some things I definitely want to share with you, but I definitely also want to hear what each of you might be thinking and what your experiences have been, whether you're a white person or a person of color, or or however you identify. I'm very curious to hear what your experiences have been. So actually, before we get going, I would love if you're able to reach your keyboard, if you could send just a little phrase about what field you work in so we could get a sense of who all is present today. So I see clergy, international humanitarian lawyer, that's cool. Nursing and education, sociology, higher education counseling, more clergy. I see community college staff and an EDD student. So we have a lot of variety, retired teacher, French professor, nursing education. It's terrific. Um, so as you can see, we have manufacturing even. We have a wide variety of people here today. So I want to make sure that we try to address anti-racism from a lot of different facets. And also the word educator, I try to define really broadly. So to my mind, you are an educator if you are helping people to learn new things in any capacity. So that might even be, if we have somebody here who's in manufacturing, they may very well be helping people learn about new things every day in the work they do. So we're going to try to do broad definitions and try to do some broad stories that might apply to all of us. So with that, I'll pass it back to Lena.
So, my first question, Sarah, and I would like the audience as well in the chat to put your answer quickly, and then Sarah can give us her answer. How would you define racism and anti-racism? So, if everyone in the audience would please put that in the chat too. How would you define racism and anti-racism?
Admittedly, very tough questions. And I'll say, it says a lot about where we are as a country that we can't seem to agree on definitions, or even a world that we can't seem to agree on definitions of what something as pervasive as racism is. Yet I will say, and this will come out in multiple ways throughout our talk today, that despite the fact that we can't seem to agree on definitions, we live in a society where race continues to be one of the biggest predictors of life chances and successes. So I feel like it's something that's pervasive through all of society. Let's see. Jesse says racism to me is prejudice plus power. Okay, that's great. Elsa says racism is implicit or explicit belief of a systemic hierarchy that puts whiteness at the top. Elizabeth Kirby says anti-racism is actively combating racism. Yes, I like that word active. Drawing generalizations based on race that could be bad or even benign. Anti-racism is actively pushing back against racism. Very good. Thank you, everybody. So hopefully we'll expand our definitions of this a little bit today. I've given this an awful lot of thought. And one thing I want to say as somebody who is trying to become more, I'm trying to make this part of my daily practice. As I said, I'm not by any means the resident expert on this subject. So I'll probably allude to other scholars, especially scholars of color and thinkers of color and activists of color as we go through today. So the definition that I like the most of racism comes from Ibram X. Kendi. He talks about, and he wrote a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, if that's something that any of you are interested in. It's a terrific primer for kind of learning about these issues. His definition is a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. And what does he mean by racism? He says racism itself is the privileging of one racial group while creating disadvantages for another and leaving a gap in the well-being of the group that's disadvantaged. And one thing I want to point out that's really important about that is that race doesn't even have to be mentioned by that definition for a policy to be a racist policy. And I really like what he has to say about racist policies being married to racist ideas, because I think a lot of you may have encountered the idea that racism is somehow primarily interpersonal prejudice or hatred or ignorance or just feeling based. Whereas I think that what Kendi is trying to tell us, as a scholar of racism and someone who's lived experiences as a Black man, is that we need a definition that includes both individual and systemic issues, because it's not just a battle for the hearts and minds of people. You can have plenty of people who would say adamantly that they're anti-racist, and yet racism runs like a machine in the background that if we just let it be, we are responsible for what it produces. So as I said, you don't even have to necessarily be actively acting in a racist way to be contributing to the perpetuation of a racist system. Some other definitions that I like related to racism talk about it as being not a binary. So it's not like you either are or you aren't. Ibram X. Kendi says that it's more like a peelable name tag, that you might have it on when you're taking a particular action, that you're being racist in that moment, but it doesn't mean that you're a good or a bad person. It's not an on-off switch necessarily. It just means that the name tag goes on if we're acting in a racist way in that moment, but we can peel it back off if we take anti-racist actions. So what do I mean about anti-racist? I want to say, first of all, that I think a lot of you really had the notion of actively acting against racist systems. And I've come through the years to really think that that's a big part of it, that of not just letting it become something that we put to the background of our lives, particularly if you're a white person, because it's a kind of privilege to even be able to stop thinking about racism. Ibram X. Kendi says that it's rooted in powerful self-interest as opposed to in hatred and ignorance. So if we're talking about systems that are perpetuated, as we're seeing today, honestly, with the second Trump administration, by people who want to consolidate and keep their powerful self-interest together and to make sure that it doesn't get just spread out to others. Anti-racism counters policies that make that happen. So one thing I like that he says is that white supremacy is the nation's oldest pyramid scheme, in the sense that it gets us to believe that if we do better, other people have to do worse. And that if we are at the top, other people have to be at the bottom. So anti-racism is indeed, to my mind, the work of actively opposing racism in all its forms by advocating for changes in political, economic, and social life, and even interpersonally. And that may be the realm where most of us have the most influence. So we have to acknowledge that racism is taking place all around us and take active steps continually to challenge the practices that we see happening all around us in our spheres of influence, wherever we happen to work. And this might involve constant reflection and self-accountability in examining where we also maintain biases and privileges. And then finally, amplifying marginalized voices, whether it may be our colleagues, or it may also be, if we're a teacher of some kind, making sure that we're using sources that are including diverse voices, not just white male voices. So that's a starting point. There's so much more I could say about that, but that's kind of where my mind is at these days as far as what constitutes racism versus anti-racism.
So, Dr. Dorr, you started to give us some really concrete, practical ideas of how we can begin our journey as an anti-racist. You talked about looking for resources, looking for references that promote a broader spectrum of perspective. What else can you suggest when we're at the beginning of this, either inside a classroom or just in our daily lives?
That's such an important question. So how do you actually practice anti-racism? I think it might be different for each one of us, and it very well may change day to day. I got a really poignant way of asking this question from one of the participants in the anti-racist reading and discussion groups that I used to lead. The way she put it was, how do I go from saying something that's maybe more ignorant, like I don't see color, to being able to honestly say, I do see you? And I really love that, because I think a big part of this is about forming genuine relationships that can lead to genuine allyship. So part of what that requires, I think, is coming at this with a beginner's mind and persistent self-awareness, where even if we're faced with having to kind of humble ourselves and see where we're making mistakes in our daily lives or even in our work, to be able to say, okay, I can have enough of a sense of self to say that I've made a mistake, and how do I repair that mistake with curiosity and openness rather than defensiveness and denial. So it might be confessing where we find ourselves acting in racist ways. So for example, I'll give a personal story real quick about this. When I was starting out in my doctorate in 2013, I was in a cohort of primarily people of color. It was about 20 of us total, and there were only about 3 people, or excuse me, there were only about 3 white people in a room that was mostly people of color. And I found myself thinking that the only way to engage in a really difficult conversation about race and class was for me to almost insert myself and talk about devil's advocate points. Like, what would I argue to somebody who's not a part of this conversation, who doesn't already agree with everything that we're talking about? But what that did was derail the conversation. And it was brought to my attention by the professor that I was essentially dominating and centering it on whiteness. And at the time, that was really hard to hear because, of course, that wasn't my intention. But the impact of what I was doing was derailing the conversation and making it so that it wasn't as safe a place for the students of color who were also trying to engage in that conversation. So I had to acknowledge that what I had been attributing as just my personality of that's how I interact in a classroom might also be that I've been rewarded my whole life as a white student for being able to speak up like that and counter authority and speak up with the devil's advocate point of view. But in fact, in that moment, that's not what was called for. So I needed to, in the space that I was holding, that I was helping to hold with the other students, I needed to step back and just listen. And I would say, as far as practicing anti-racism in our spaces, one really interesting challenge that I received recently that really impacted me personally came from someone on Instagram who was saying that even if you're an introvert, meaning that you get recharged and your batteries get recharged by being alone more than being with people, you still can have powerful conversations with others. You might not be the loudest voice out in the streets, protesting and doing those kinds of actions, but that doesn't mean that you can't bring this into your day-to-day life when you see it at work. And it doesn't mean that you have to always be the loud, nagging voice to the people in your life that don't agree with these things. But it might mean that you make sure that it's top of mind and you make sure that you don't let racist comments just go by if they're happening among your colleagues or among your family members. So one thing that I found is helpful in this regard is trying to see anti-racism almost like a daily practice. For some of you, that might be almost like a spiritual practice, or it might be for some of you almost more like a psychological or meditation practice. Just saying to yourself, this is an important priority. This is something that it matters in the world at large and it matters to my life. And so I want to make it something that every day I do a little bit to chip away and I ask myself, what can I do today? Or how can I confront a mistake maybe that I've made today to become the kind of person that people of color feel safe around and the kind of person that is a genuine ally to others. So there's a lot more that I could say about that, but I'll leave it there for now. There's a lot of specific actions. Actually, the one thing I will say in addition to that is that there's a lot of specific actions that we can take. If you're really not sure where to start, in today's world, especially again with the second Trump administration, it feels like there's something new every moment to react to, something new that feels terrible and that definitely has racist overtones, if not overt racist consequences. So I would say that some of the things that we can do to get a sense of power back and to be anti-racist are to make sure that we vote local, that we get into our schools, for example, like with the school boards, maybe that we push our mayor and our city council for police reform, not just at the top levels of the federal government, but again, in our local cities. I think if you're in a union at work, you can speak up in your union, because I've heard a lot of powerful stories about where people have found that that's actually been an area where they've been able to make some substantive change. In your spending, you can choose Black-owned businesses or person of color-owned businesses to try to really be mindful and cultivate and curate where are you spending your money. And then, of course, if you are a teacher or even in your own personal life, you can also curate the sources of information and even entertainment that you have in your life. So you can make sure that you're including people of color in those, in that curated space. That's a part of what you consume every day and what you recommend to others, because people do listen to your opinion. Even if you think of yourself as someone who doesn't have a lot of power in the spaces you're in, chances are people do listen to your opinion. Um, David Smith says local action might be the most impactful right now. Grassroots work from the progression community is critical for the long term. Absolutely agree, David. I think that's very true. That local work might be where it all begins. So I'll leave it there for now and I'll pass it back to Lena.
So I'm going to ask you a question that is very critical for me personally as an educator. I will be in front of a classroom or with a group of students, and I pass as white. Most of my students, a majority of my students are of either African descent or other minorities. And so I do try to always bring up issues of race. Doesn't always feel comfortable. It doesn't feel right. So what would you recommend, how to go about practicing that and addressing it in the classroom? And also there's this power dynamic, right? Because I'm the teacher, I'm the authority figure.
Absolutely. I think that that's really important, and that's something that I think a lot of people who are in educational positions don't always take into account, is the fact that there's what we refer to as intersectionality at work there, which means that not only in that case, Lena, are you a white woman who is speaking to this a group of students who might be mostly students of color, but also you're a professor who's in a position of power. So that might not, as much as each of us want to think that we're an approachable person and that people can talk to us easily, it might be that we actually are more intimidating and less approachable than we believe, and that it's really important to bring in what's referred to as culturally relevant pedagogy. So by that, I mean making sure that we are taking extra special care to be inclusive of not only the sources that we use in the classroom, but also the kind of classroom environment that we're creating before we even seek to have those kinds of conversations. And I think part of what that means is making sure that we are leaving room for people to make mistakes, that we're leaving room for people to explore and ask questions throughout the course of the class, not just when we're having conversations about race. I think it also might mean that we can't, honestly, there's times where we really can't force students of color in those situations to have conversations that they may not be ready to have with a mixed group of people or with a white professor. I think we can make sure that it's clear that we welcome and we value those opinions. But I think it might be that one thing I've noticed, for instance, in doing these groups through the years, is that the work of anti-racism looks very different for people of color than it does for white people. I think it's a painful conversation to have either way, but for people of color who are experiencing constant microaggressions, and which means like small, almost like small cuts from the world that add up to being constantly assailed by racism, it may be that it's just too painful a topic to talk about. One of the writers that I really like, Ijeoma Oluo, who wrote "So You Want to Talk About Race," she says that it feels like being in an abusive relationship with the world sometimes to be a person of color. That because any one little thing might not seem like a big deal, and people might think you're making too much of it, but in fact, when all of those things add up, it adds up to an abusive relationship. So just like what we would have with the person, one remark or one indignity might not mean that someone is being abusive, but when it adds up over time and it's coming from all different sides, I think that can make for a powerful experience of pain for someone of color. So I think that we have to be really careful, especially if you are white and you're in a position of power or educational authority. To take those things into account, and to try to come at it too with a beginner's mind and realize that just because we like to think of ourselves as really aware on these issues, I shouldn't use the word woke because I feel like now it's gotten kind of a pejorative meaning associated with it. But just because we think of ourselves in that light doesn't necessarily mean that that the other person feels safe with us. And I think we have to ask ourselves in those conversations whose voices are not being heard, and could I perhaps talk to them privately, one-on-one, to make sure I'm genuinely interested in hearing what they have to say, even if they don't want to share it in the case of, in the space of the whole room. There's a lot of ways that I think professors in particular, or anybody who's in a position of educational authority, can practice having those tough conversations. If you are in a position, for instance, with family as well, or friends or colleagues who are either anti-DEI, or they just think all these issues are too much, they don't know why it's such a big deal. I think that it's important to try to remind them that that you're there to also hear what they have to say, and that you're not trying to automatically change their mind. I think that goes a really long way to making people's hearts soften and make them willing to talk to you, and see you as somebody that they might actually accept influence from. So I'll leave it there for now, Lena.
Um, you gave us some ideas about how to have difficult conversations with people who maybe are not on the same page as far as DEI. Any other suggestions? You mentioned about talking to them about how, or starting the conversation with, I'm not trying to change you. But what else? How else can we start these conversations with people who are not on the same page as we are?
I think a lot of folks who I think a lot of folks who are not on the same page about this are saying that, first of all, I think they're trying to oftentimes make the argument that race doesn't matter in today's society, that with still making the argument maybe that we live in a post-racial world, that, race, people are really harping on race, and why are they harping on it so much if it's something we've already dealt with? But of course, and of course, people of color can readily say that's not been my experience of life at all. But even other white folks, maybe especially other white folks, can say as gently as they can make the argument that race may seem to be a mirage, and it is a socially created construct, but there are so much evidence in every sector of society that we've organized around that construct in very real ways that really shape the trajectory of people's actual lives, and that make it necessary to think about the real consequences that are happening to people of color, and even to white people, because of living in a state of white supremacy every day. I also think that one thing we can say to help them feel less defensive is to help them realize that disadvantaged white people are not erased by discussions of disadvantages facing people of color, in the same way that brain cancer is not erased by discussing breast cancer. These are two different kinds of, they're linked and they're related, but they're two different kinds of problems that both require us to think about and come up with solutions collectively. And if they say, why does everything have to be about race? I feel like it's something that is talked about too much. I think a lot of people seem to feel weary of it being talked about so much. We can remind them that nobody's saying it's only about race, but race is an underlying factor that comes into play in so many societal issues that if we don't take it into account, any solutions we come up with are going to be lacking. And I think we also can remind the person that, they might be coming from a position of their own lived experience, but we can gently remind them that their experience might seem different than that of people of color, but that's because they've never lived themselves in the shoes of a person of color. So they might say, oh, well, I've never seen racism. But particularly if they're a white male, let's say, they wouldn't be encountering a lot of the daily indignities that happen to people of color all over the place. So I think it's important to talk to a person that is against what we're talking about when it comes to race, with a spirit of gentleness and curiosity, but just kind of consistently bringing it back to the facts, the evidence that is out there to support the fact that race continues to be a pervasive factor in all of our lives. Oh, and the last thing I'd say about that too, that I thought was really good advice from Ijeoma Oluo, again, that she wrote, So You Want to Talk About Race. She says that if you're having a conversation and it feels like you're not getting anywhere, sometimes it can be because you're really talking about two different things. So again, with the getting curious, she suggests asking the person, kind of resetting the conversation and asking the person to confirm what it is they're really trying to communicate, what they're even talking about, and to see if the two of you are on the same page. And if they're willing to have the conversation conversation that you're trying to have with them, because it may well be that they're not ready to have that conversation. And if that's the case, then it may be worth kind of delaying that until later, and just hoping that you've planted a seed in that moment. So those are some of the things that come to mind for me.
Dr. Dorr, I'd like to open it now to the audience and see if they have anything that they would like to comment on or any questions. But is there anything, any final words you'd like to make sure you get in before we start that?
One thing that I would absolutely suggest, and this could apply to people of color or white people alike, is that I found it very interesting to take the Harvard implicit association tests. If any of you have ever taken those, basically they show you images in a rapid fire way, and ask you to quickly select what your association is with those images. And you might be surprised, like I myself was really surprised at how I still have some implicit biases, whether related to race or religion or sexuality. They've got all kinds of different areas of privilege and oppression. So I'm going to put the link for that in the chat for all of you. I believe, let's see, implicit. Yeah, it's implicit.harvard.edu. And that might be something to even consider using with your students. If you are someone who teaches or you're someone who has that kind of influence over others, it's something worth sharing, because it's not the results it gives you are pretty incontrovertible, and they're humbling, and they help you see that even if you're someone who's been awake to these issues for a long time, we all still have areas where we need to grow. So I would say that those are my biggest takeaways. Oh, the last other thing I'd like to say too, before we get into Q&A, is just that my feeling is that this is an area that's so large and so overwhelming that a lot of people, white people in particular, who have the privilege of stepping away from it and not thinking about it, feel like, well, that's just more than I can chew. I don't want to even get into all that. But I think that when we look at racism as a system, it becomes much larger and more complicated than it seemed to be like when we thought of it as just individual prejudice. But there's also a lot more opportunity to address the various parts of it. There's a lot more entry points to say, here's where I could have some influence over at least a small part of what's happening in the world around racism. So to me, that's a hopeful takeaway, is to tell ourselves that as big as it seems, in part that's because there's so many nuances that we can address. And no one's asking any one of us to address them all at once or even over the course of our lifetimes. We might have a very specific niche in which we can actually make a difference. And again, that's true for people who are white and people who are who identify as someone of color. In either case, I think that we all have our sort of niche where we can decide that we're going to make a difference in this on a daily basis.
So David, was there any questions in the chat that we should talk about now?
No, I didn't see any questions. I think Sarah was addressing most of them. So we
Are
should
there any questions from our audience or any comments?
people should just raise their hand, and Lena, you can call on them.
Come on, don't be shy. I know
Oh,
we have
Lena,
more.
I think Jesse's
Yeah,
hand is.
Lena, do you see it?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Go ahead. Sorry, didn't see you, Jesse. Go ahead.
Hi, you guys. Thank you so much, Sarah. One of the biggest things, you several times mentioned the current administration, and things have just gotten so extreme that I question all of our, best use of limited time and energy, because before my focus really was on trying to have these conversations across divides and, engage with people and slowly maybe plant seeds that could change hearts and minds, build relationships, all that. I do somewhat question, with things being this extreme, whether the best use of our time and energy is to throw our weight, whatever weight we have, behind movements that are fighting some of these things, these anti-immigrant, anti-trans, racist, anti-DEI stuff. Like, should it be more of an active fight, or is it still worth it trying to have these conversations across the ideological divide?
That's such a good question. My thought is that it's sort of a both and that they serve very different purposes. So one thing I've really learned from the scholars in this area, including Ibram X. Kendi and Ijeoma Oluo, is that there is both the individual component, the hearts and minds aspect, like you said, of racism, but then underlying all of that is a structure that's already built. And again, like even if we change hearts and minds, that structure will still be in place unless we work to dismantle it. And so I think, especially in the current times, it may well be that the best use of our time, our limited energy and time, because we're all so assailed by a constant stream of upsetting news, is to try to throw, as you said, Jesse, throw our weight behind existing movements. And that could mean donating, that could mean protesting, that could mean going to interest group meetings and making sure that we find some way to be involved, even if behind the scenes. There's all different kinds of ways, I think, to get involved. It could also mean making sure to be in regular touch via phone, because that's what they listen to the most, more than email, with their Congress people, and making sure they know that that's a high priority for us. Even the ones that are on our side, the ones that believe that these are really important issues, I think that it's important to be in touch with them and let them know that you're keeping an eye on what they do and making sure that they're voting in a way that reflects those values. But I'm very curious if anyone else wants to comment on trying to walk that fine line between having important conversations around this, but also taking relevant action out in the world, collective action.
One of the things David and I talk about is that we are sort of in the stage of our career where we are mentoring others, and that David has often mentioned that he feels in many environments that he needs to promote others. Like, he could do it, but he's a white man. He's my husband, so I can talk about him that way. Um, Um, and so rather than him taking on the role of a leader in any kind of community organization, he can be the one to nominate somebody who doesn't have those natural, like you said, hierarchical benefits and privileges. Um,
That's allyship is really important right now.
but
I
it's
used,
more than
yeah,
allyship, you
it
know?
used. I'll give you an example. There was a period of time before the pandemic. I do a lot of. I don't do so much DEI work now, but I used to do DEI training, and I came to a point about 4 or 5 years ago that I felt like being a white man in the front of the room probably was not where I needed to be. So I was asked by an organization, a teacher organization, about 3 years ago to do some training, and I said, "Look, recognize who I am. I'm going to bring a partner in." So I found an individual who's a good colleague. She's a woman of color. She does this much more than I do. And I said, look, I'm going to take a back seat. I'm going to learn from you. I'm going to be part of it, but you're going to be in the front of the room, not me. And she says, that's what we should do. We don't want to say that white men shouldn't be part of this, but sometimes it's important that we kind of shift who's kind of in front of the room. And it worked really, really well. And I'm always cognizant of that when I'm asked to do things. I think about whether I'm the right person anymore. And I want to be there for people, but there's another role that I can play. So thanks for bringing that up, Lena.
I agree, actually. I think that there are times where it's important to step in, and there's other times where it's better to step back and propel like somebody else whose voice is actually probably, more poignant, has more expertise than we have, and is just in a better position to influence than what we have. But there are times where, I think maybe the key question to ask ourselves in any given moment is who am I trying to have an influence on right now? And is it more important that they hear this from me, or is there someone who would be more powerful for them to hear this from? If it's your own family or your own friends, obviously, or your colleagues, it may well be that it's important that they hear it from you directly. But in other cases, it might be that it's not our role to be the leader per se. It's our role to be a supporter. Any other comments on that question? And then I see Rashida's hand is up.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, Rashida.
Hope you can hear me okay.
Mhm.
I think that these conversations are extremely important and imperative to have. I have to say that as a Black woman, as a covering Muslim woman, it's a lot to unpack, and I don't know if it'll ever stop. I I never really feel, and I'm speaking for myself, and I'm speaking for a lot of my colleagues and a lot of my patients and my students and classmates as well, that I don't think I'll ever feel safe. I don't think that it'll ever be safe. Um, but I think that having these conversations is a start. And it's going to take years, just like it took years to uh, uh, to abolish slavery in a way, just like it took years to for the N word not to be a part of someone's normal vocabulary, just like it took years for Black people or people of color not to be looked at as less than. These conversations are going to take years to make a change, and probably take years to turn into action. But as a person of color, I love these conversations. I love hearing them take place. I think that they should happen more often. I feel like this is a safe space, so I'll say I was talking to I'm in the I've been in many spaces where I've been the only. I worked at Shock Trauma in Baltimore where I was the only on my unit. I went to Georgetown where I was the only in some of my classes. I am getting my DMP NPH at Hopkins, where sometimes in the room I am the only. However, and I was having this conversation with a classmate of mine, and I said to her, I need an artist to just draw, just depict what I have gone through in my career as a Black woman. And this artist would draw a Black woman with an arm full of credentials and degrees and experience and skill falling out of her arms, just over, like, just arms full and things spilling out on the floor. And next to her will be a white woman with nothing. And behind the desk will be someone in HR or a manager that points to the white woman and says, I pick her. And this is a lot of what we deal with. This is a lot of what our students will have to deal with. I see patients for telehealth, for infectious disease, and the amount of people who of color who do not have digital health literacy, the amount of people who cannot connect for their appointments, are a lot of people of color. So it's so much, it's so overwhelming. And I find myself in so many different parts in my career in academia and life where I'm seeing inequities and where I'm seeing imbalance. But I can say that born in the 70s, these conversations didn't always take place. So they're so much appreciated. I see my students at Montgomery College, who the Black students, they do have to work harder than the white students. I do see that imbalance. I do see some of the white students, and even when I'm talking, I think up until the point that I just said that, I get so uncomfortable sometimes. I'm showing a documentary called Everybody's Work, and it's about health inequities and racism. I'm showing it at the college tomorrow. And I cannot tell you how many times I looked at the documentary and felt uncomfortable. Janet was showing it at the college. Who was I going to make uncomfortable? Who was in the audience that was not of color? How? Because I have to think of all sides. You know, I'm not just for my Black patients and my Black students, or my students of color or patients of color. I'm for everyone. So, you know, but at the same time, it's the truth. What's in the documentary is the truth, and it needs to be shown, and it needs to be said. But at the same time, as a person of color, I still feel a little uneasy with showing it, because who's going to be insulted by it? So you know, I'll wrap up by saying I don't think it's, I just don't think it's ever going to stop. But I do appreciate and thank you for, Lena, thank you for inviting me. And
Thank you. Thank you for coming and all your comments, Professor Chisholm. And would you do us a favor? Would you put the information about the documentary in the chat?
I will. Thank you.
Professor Chisholm, thank you so much for your comments. They are so much appreciated, and your vulnerability is so much appreciated, especially given that one thing that I feel like I've learned through mistakes and practice myself over the years is that people of color do not owe us that kind of vulnerability or even relationships if they feel unsafe with us. And it really is, you know, the onus is on us to make ourselves safe people and to constantly interrogate, are there ways that I could be a safer person? At least as, you know, as an individual friend or a colleague or, you know, a confidant or whatever the case may be. And one thing that hearing Professor Chisholm's comments makes me think of too is that it's for people who don't want to have these conversations or they just feel weary about them. It's important for us to all keep in mind always that the reason that it's painful is because racism exists and it is painful, not because these conversations are happening. Like the talking about this stuff is not causing the pain. Racism is causing the pain. And there is a degree to which we're bringing the pain to the surface by talking about it. And even if we make mistakes or, you know, put our foot in our mouth, which, you know, as I said, I've definitely done, I'm sure all of us have definitely done that. It's still important to keep having them. It's still important to keep talking. In part because I think talking is part of what leads to action. It's part of what softens people's hearts and makes them willing to take action. I really, really appreciate your comments, Professor Chisholm. Oh, thank you. So if anybody has not seen it, she's put the link to the link to everybody's work in the chat. That's great. Or is it the link to the event? Let me see. Is it the link to the event or the link to the documentary?
It's a link to the event.
Oh, perfect. That's awesome. Thank you.
Well, so that you can kind of copy it and look at it on your own time. But this is the link to the event. Yes. Thank you very much.
And I'm going to read, she may be unable to come off of mute, but I'll read from Rosangela, a dear friend of mine who I so appreciate being here today, all the way from Brazil. Rosangela says, thank you so much, Rashida. My name is Rosangela Malachias. There are 34 years that I've worked as an activist of the Brazilian Black movement. I have a dream. It is to have only one day without having to fight against racism. When the problem is not against me or my family, it happens with other Black people. So for this reason, the problem becomes mine too. The worst is the way how white people think that racism is not important, and it is a problem for Black people to find the solution. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Rosangela. That is exactly right. Like that, I think part of making this a daily practice, whether a spiritual practice or just a physical or a mental or emotional practice, is trying to remind ourselves that this belongs to us as well. This is our work. This is not a Black problem or a person of color problem. It's a humanity problem. And, you know, it's like in that way, it's sort of like a cancer. You know, cancer may be localized. It may seem localized in one area of the body, but it can kill the whole body. And it can affect the health of the whole body. So yeah, thank you so much, Rosangela. And we got another comment that I may want to comment on as well from Sabrina. She says, one thing I always find difficult is that we try to prescribe individual prescriptions to issues that are inherently systemic. While individual attitudes can and do change, it is very dispiriting that we see a mainstreaming of scapegoating DEI and dismantling work towards systemic diversity, equity, and inclusion. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sabrina. That is for sure. It's been very discouraging to see how quickly that can have the legs cut out from underneath of it. And it'll be interesting to see. There may be many opportunities for some of us who are educators in our various realms in the future to try to still advocate for keeping those programs and keeping those things alive, even if the administration says that we're not allowed to do that. Even if our workplace officially dismantles it, there are ways that I think we'll have to be creative about keeping those initiatives alive and making sure, for instance, that the situation that Professor Chisholm mentioned, where you might see a colleague that's white get preferenced over a colleague of color in like a job situation, that if we're in a position to hire anybody, or if we're in a position to fire anybody, or if we're in a position to promote anybody, that we ask ourselves, am I at all times, like, am I bringing any individual biases or systemic biases into this situation? That's so important. Are there any other questions or comments from people in our group today? Thank you all so much for being here. We have a group of 31 people present. And I know each of you has probably been through some really important things around race, or you probably wouldn't be here. So whether you have a question, a comment, or perhaps a story to share that might be helpful for any of us, I would love to hear from you. Oh, thank you so much, David. David attached the Forage Center's commitment to DEIB, which I hope that we will maintain regardless of what the administration says about it. And David is nodding.
I heard recently somewhere somebody said that maybe it would, I think they were meaning as a joke, but the more I think about it, the more I think it might be a good idea. They're saying we shouldn't call it DEI. We should say what that stands for, because how could anybody admit to saying they're not interested in diversity? They're not interested in including everybody. I can't imagine anyone would feel that way or come out and say it. So maybe we have to stop using the acronym.
I agree. I think it's similar to critical race theory in that it's been co-opted to the point where the meaning is almost lost of what it actually is, and what it's actually trying to do. And in fact, one of the things that I remember reading about racism, you often will hear people who are opposed to this stuff say, oh, affirmative action, for example, or DEI initiatives are like a reverse racism, because they think, oh, this is disadvantaging white people in favor of people of color. But I think in a case like that, it's important for us as witnesses to that, especially if you're white, but even if you're a person of color, to say, let's look at the whole picture. If in the whole picture, there's already a disadvantage if you are a person of color in a certain field, for example, then trying to correct that imbalance it may be temporarily seeming to disadvantage a white person or white people who are applying for a role, let's say. But in the big picture, what it's trying to do is correct a systemic imbalance. I think that's really important. I see Rachel's hand is raised. Rachel, the floor is yours. Oh, Rachel, I think you're still muted. I'm sorry.
It's all right. I was trying to unmute. It was difficult. I wanted to offer sort of an addition to what you all were just saying. I've been doing this stuff for a really long time. I teach sociology. I teach classes on racism and race and ethnicity. And one of the things that I think is important for us to also think about is not just what we are against, but what we are for. And so I've sort of taken the position, especially with the uninitiated, for example, of not using the term anti-racism a lot. Now, in certain groups and contexts, I use that a lot more, but I sort of want people to know what do we want? We want a world where people are not discriminated against, a world where, people are treated fairly, opportunities, and we can all share in that. And I think for a lot of the past several years, we have allowed people who are not part of these movements or these concerns to define what we're doing. And then we're responding to them saying that we're doing things that we're not even doing. So it's really important when we do this kind of work to be very clear about this is what we want. This is not what just we are against, but we want a world where, we see these things where everybody gets a fair chance, where people are treated obviously, like the platitude would be on the content of their character. And I think it's really important. We're going to have to go back to a lot of that kind of stuff. Because not everybody's starting out with a fundamental understanding. A lot of people are starting out at a very, this is not a 101 level, it's like a 095 level. And when you're out and listening to media that distorts these things, it's really imperative for us to define what we're doing. So I just wanted to say that.
That's so important. Thank you, Rachel. I totally agree. And I think reframing DEI efforts in a positive light as far as like what we are seeking to achieve, not just what we're opposed to, not just the negatives that people might be opposed to or that they can latch onto, but like what are we seeking to achieve? Which are things that the hope is that everybody, at least in theory, would agree, like, oh, we wouldn't want to see that as well. And it becomes harder to, becomes harder to counter at that point. Before we start to wrap up, I just want to point out to everybody, David posted in the chat the survey, a feedback survey, which we would very much appreciate if you take 2 minutes, a minute or two to just complete. If you have a chance to do that. We'll also post it as a comment when we post a recording of this on our YouTube channel. And I also want to include, I just put in the chat, there's a Facebook group that I've run for a few years now that's been more or less active depending on what's going on in my life, if I'm being honest, called Starting With Ourselves. It is the group that initially started as a support group for those who were involved in the reading and discussion groups that I used to lead. But if you'd like to join it, I'm hoping to keep it going again, especially with the advent of this administration, that we can kind of all continue this conversation together. So again, please complete that feedback survey if you're able, and also consider joining our Facebook group. And then David also posted the Forage Center, which is our wonderful host for this conversation. So we only have about 5 minutes left. Does anybody else have a comment or a story or a question? Oh, thank you, Jesse.
One thing I wanted to share was that I was attending a training on racism and anti-racism, and the moderator started by saying, "This is a safe space. We should all feel comfortable sharing. Everything that's said here will stay here." And during that session, I felt very uncomfortable and very attacked. And I went up to the moderator and I said to him, "You told me this was a safe space." And he said something to me that has been sitting in my brain now ever since, and I've been hearing it over and over. He said, "I said it's safe. I didn't say you wouldn't feel uncomfortable."
Mm-hmm.
And I think this goes on. I tell my students this all the time, not related to race, but related to being uncomfortable. That I think culturally we feel like we should always be successful, we should always be getting A's, and we should always feel like we're moving forward. And we don't feel comfortable with being uncomfortable. We think it's failure, we think it's a bad thing, and we avoid it. And I try to tell myself and my students, you're going to feel uncomfortable. You're going to be in the classroom and you're not going to know and you're not going to understand and you're not going to always be getting A's and you're going to feel uncomfortable. And that's a good thing, because when you're uncomfortable, that's when you're really learning something powerful.
That's so cool, Lena. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I think discomfort is at the root of all learning on some level. And so I do think it's important. What you just said is so important. I posted something in the chat that we use in a small, a regular meeting small group that I'm a part of. It's a poem called Brave Space, and it makes a distinction between a brave space versus a safe space. And I think that when it comes to these conversations, it's more important that we create brave space where people can indeed make mistakes and they can feel uncomfortable, but they can still hold, opposites within them or difficulties within them, and still learn to grow in those settings. So safe might imply that they get to remain static in their status quo where they already are. But Lena, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's really important. And again, just make sure that you all fill out the feedback survey if you're able. We're so appreciative of you being here. Are there any other comments or questions before we close out today, or before I pass it back to David? In that case, David, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah and Lena. This was really an important, to say it's timely is an understatement. We are dealing with existential crises right now that impact education, globalization, such a myriad of so many different fields. So the challenges are in front of us, and educators are always best positioned to rally the troops and to move forward. We have a lot to do. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Sarah and Lena. Sarah and Lena, I would Sarah and Lena, I would ask you if you can put in your contact information in the chat also, that would be useful. Also, we will be doing another Forage Center conversation soon. We have other on our website. So if you go to the website that I posted, look under our Forage Center conversations, you will see past ones. This will be posted on YouTube. It'll probably take us a few days so that you can share it. So kind of come back to our website periodically. Or if you fill out the survey, then we have your contact information and we can send it right to you. That would be great also. If you go to our website, you can also sign up for a newsletter. Our next major activity will be in June, where we do our annual humanitarian education simulation in Garrett County, Maryland. This tends to be for graduate students, but we do have community college students. A lot of you are community college educators who role play at this simulation, which is basically replicating a humanitarian crisis. So if you've got students who are interested in humanitarian work and they're from community college, then reach out to us and let us know, and we may be able to get them involved. So once again, thank you. Thank you, Sarah and Lena. It is a rainy day here in Washington, D.C. We had ice this morning. I hope the weather is a bit better where you are. We're expecting snow next week. But I know in other parts of the country there isn't much snow, so we don't really know to expect weather wherever we are. So thank you all from Washington. Have a great week, and then look out for other things that we'll be conducting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for everything. Have a great day, everyone.